As you know, here on this program, we take government policy with regard to the transgender issue and how it affects children in our schools pretty seriously. It's a constant theme. And a news story out of National Review shed some light on what happened about 2 years ago in the state of South Dakota. Just to remind you, Kristi Noem, the governor there, was faced with a bill on her desk to sign into law having to do with biological males competing in women's sports, as many governors around the country had to deal with over the last 2 years. What happened next and what decision she made as governor in that state is something that is incredibly telling for everyone in this country, no matter what state you're living in. Joining us right now is the staff writer who covered this story and really bore into this in a very comprehensive way, Nate Hochman. Nate, great reporting here. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Larry. Appreciate it.
So, first of all, if I set this up wrong, please correct me, but this is how I remember the story playing out. In fact, a lot of people who love Kristi Noem and really saw her as a potential presidential pick, maybe in 24, or maybe a vice presidential pick, they were really stunned by the fact that she vetoed this law. What exactly happened here in South Dakota?
No, I think you're right to set it up with that March 2021 veto of the women's sports bill, because that really was the sort of beginning of suspicions about Kristi Noem and South Dakota in general. To your point, she had been understandably someone that a lot of conservatives across the country looked at as not just sort of a potential 2024 contender, but really sort of setting the bar when it came to COVID policy.
Yeah.
Now, her representation of a record on that was deceptive, but that's a completely different issue. But anyway, she was supposed to be a conservative fighter, and then out of nowhere, she vetoes this legislation that a lot of other red states have passed, this women's sports bill, to keep men who said they were women out of women's sports.
Yeah.
And that was shocking to a lot of conservatives. And what we uncovered and sort of continued to uncover since then is that Noem is very closely tied to the largest employer in the state, which is a healthcare company, Sanford Health, which is deeply invested in lobbying for sort of pro-gender ideology policies, and has killed much more than just the women's sports bill in South Dakota over the last few years.
Very interesting. And we have covered here the big bucks behind the pharmaceutical prescriptions for puberty blockers and transition drugs, as well as, of course, the surgical procedures themselves. At the time, correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, I thought that the governor had said that she was motivated by the fact that the NCAA might punish South Dakota based on the language in the law at the time, and that sponsors might punish South Dakota with in their athletic events, the football teams, other tournaments that might take place there. Was that not a valid concern from the governor?
Well, it wasn't a valid concern insofar as plenty of other states have passed the exact same bill, and they haven't run into that, at least at the issue that it's the level that it's been an issue. But it certainly was a valid concern for Sanford Health, this big healthcare company, because Sanford, the same day that Noem issued her veto in March 2021, had announced a $50 million expansion of Sanford's sports complex, which was the biggest athletic facility in the state. It had brought the first NCAA games ever to South Dakota, and they were going to
Ah.
lose a whole lot of money if the NCAA pulled their games from the state, because they would be losing that kind of revenue. And so that was sort of Noem again speaking for Sanford's interests, I think, rather than South Dakota's.
See, that makes more sense. I'm no fan of the NCAA. I think it's a feckless organization. But if I remember right, they haven't actually taken a firm stance on the transgender athlete issues. They've left it up to the governing bodies of each individual sport. So, what has the Nome administration's response been to this? This should be pretty clear for them to be able to either confirm or deny.
Well, they sort of continue to say that they're not making any sort of improper steps. That's kind of been their line throughout this. But the evidence has piled up again and again and again that Noem is very close, and some of her sort of closest advisors are actually registered Sanford lobbyists.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
for this story that I did at the end of 2021, I had multiple sources in Noem's office, some of whom have come out on the record since, say that they saw Sanford lobbyists actually walk into Noem's office and kill a bunch of anti-gender ideology bills above and beyond the women's sports bill. So Sanford has killed not just this women's sports bill, but an attempt to ban, sex change drugs and surgeries, irreversible surgeries for children, various other sort of attempts to keep men out of women's bathrooms. I mean, you name it. Like any kind of conservative transgender legislation has not passed in South Dakota because this major healthcare company runs not just the governor's office, but a large part of the state legislature as well.
Let's get back to the governor in a moment, because I don't want to make this just about Kristi Noem and what happened in her office in South Dakota, because as you lay out in this fine article at National Review, Nate, this is kind of a story that could be told in many states. The fact is, there is big bucks behind transgender procedures and prescriptions, and these healthcare agencies, they've got huge influence in government.
That's exactly right. I chose South Dakota not just because I care about what happens in a deep red state like South Dakota, but because it was a particularly sort of extreme or potent illustration of a phenomenon we see time and time and time again in red America. It's particularly extreme because South Dakota is, I think, the third most conservative state in the whole country in terms of the
Hmm.
ideology of its actual voters. It's had Republican supermajorities since 1996, and it hasn't passed a single sort of transgender law. So it's the most extreme example that I can find. But you go to North Carolina, you go to the Indiana battle over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 2015, the North Carolina
Hmm.
bathroom bill, the various attempts to sort of bully Georgia out of its voting rights law and its abortion rights law, which Governor Brian Kemp, to his credit, stood up to. You are seeing a concerted effort, and it's becoming a trend where these powerful left-wing activist groups use the consolidated power of these major business interests, which are now on their side, to undermine all of these red states' efforts to push back on stuff like the transgender lobby. And that has a real effect. And you can clearly see that in states like South Dakota.
And of course, we've covered the insidious natures of these ESG provisions that are sort of coming from global corporations on various American entities in the boardroom. It seems like it's an ideological influence because the couple of handful of very wealthy, elite, well-connected investors really want to push these issues. But here, with regard to these healthcare agencies, it seems like it's good old-fashioned political graft. They make a ton of money on these procedures, and they don't want any laws prohibiting them. By the way, they make a ton of government money. This is all covered under the Affordable Care Act, is it not?
Yeah, I think the transgender surgeries and drugs are covered under ACA, but in South Dakota,
Yeah,
prisoners can actually get sex change drugs on the taxpayer dime and transfer
yeah.
facility as well too, even in South Dakota. So that's a real issue. It's an important question. How much is this about raw profit versus how much is it about ideology? I think if you look at a major healthcare interest like Sanford, and they're not the only one lobbying for this stuff, it's one of those things where the ideology kind of plays a part, but it just lines up a little too conveniently with the fact that they're making real money off of stuff
Right.
like puberty blockers. It's just a little too perfect that trans rights happens to redounds to millions and millions of dollars off of sex change surgeries and a lifetime sort of supply of gender
Yes.
affirming quote unquote drugs.
Yes, I have no doubt in his heart Al Gore really does think carbon emissions are going to destroy the planet, but it just so happens that he has investments that makes him very wealthy if the government adopts anti-carbon laws. Let's bring it back to Kristi Noem now. Just in the case of everything we talk about this year, as you know, Nate, has to be shot through the prism of presidential politics. What was their reaction to your article here? As let's face it, if she is going to be a candidate, her her track record on policies like this will be measured against other potential governors like Glenn Youngkin or Ron DeSantis or Governor Sununu in New Hampshire.
Yeah, her reaction wasn't great. I think it's. I mean, her reaction. I didn't interact with Governor Noem herself, but her office's reaction. Ian Fury, who is her spokesman, in response to formal requests for comment that I sent. It's funny you mentioned the 2024 presidential contest because Fury, unprompted by any mention of Governor DeSantis of Florida from me, just unloaded on Ron DeSantis and went. I wrote a piece about it, and your viewers can go check it out. I posted the whole sort of email, but he went on a long rant about how Kristi Noem is the most conservative governor in America, and I was just shilling for Ron DeSantis by writing this sort of critical piece of her, even though I'd never mentioned DeSantis in the piece. So I think
Wow.
Noem has a real chip on their shoulder about Ron DeSantis, and I think the sort of the really sort of unhinged rant I got from her spokesman is a pretty good sign that she might actually be seriously considering a run in 2024.
Wow. And well, pretty interesting choice to deliver all that to you on the record or accidentally on the record. Either way, Nate Hoagman, National Review. Great stuff. More to come. Keep it here on O'Connor Tonight.